Have you ever stopped to think about how many stories we believe without ever questioning are actually true? How many times do we look at a couple, a family, an entire relationship, and simply accept the version presented to us? Because it seemed logical, comfortable, almost too obvious to be refuted. Perhaps, as you listen to this now, some memory is already coming to mind. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you more than you imagine. For years, everyone bought into the same image. He was seen as the strong man, the provider, the one who held everything together, the kind of person who entered a room and immediately received respect, admiration, and even a certain silent reverence. He was the one who spoke loudest at family gatherings, who made seemingly important decisions, who appeared to carry the financial weight of everything around him on his shoulders. In everyone's eyes, there was no doubt. Without him, nothing would work. And she was almost always there, but never in the center. Discreet, polite, too careful not to bother anyone. Always a step behind, always with a restrained smile, as if accepting the place she was given. To those observing from the outside, she seemed to depend on him for everything, financially, emotionally, socially. That's what they said. That's what they commented on. And over time, this narrative became so solid that no one felt the need to question it anymore. Perhaps you've heard similar phrases. She's lucky to have him. She wouldn't be able to handle it alone. It's a good thing he holds everything together. Comments said as compliments, but loaded with a dangerous certainty. The certainty that someone there was weak, incapable, dependent. And the most curious thing is that no one seemed to realize how much these words shaped the way she was seen and judged. Meanwhile, she remained silent. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't defend herself. She felt no need to explain anything. For many, this only confirmed the idea of submission, dependence, and fragility. But is silence always a sign of weakness? Or, in some cases, does it hide a strength that doesn't need to be announced? Have you ever been through this? Have you ever felt like people decided who you were without ever asking you anything? That they created such a convincing version of you that even you, for a moment, almost believed it? Emotional stories like this don't begin with major conflicts. They begin with accepted images, with assigned roles, with certainties that have never been tested. The truth is that everyone around believed they saw everything clearly. Friends, relatives, acquaintances. Everyone was absolutely convinced of who depended on whom. And the more time passed, the more undeniable this version became. It was comfortable to believe it. It was simple. It was easy. After all, questioning would require looking closer, and not everyone is willing to do that. But what almost no one realizes is that some relationships are built on very well-rehearsed appearances. And behind this facade of strength, power, and control, sometimes there is something completely different from what one imagines. Something that grows in silence, away from prying eyes, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And it is precisely from this image that everyone bought into without suspecting anything that this story begins to unfold in an unexpected way. Because when the truth begins to give small signs, it doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it just waits for someone to be ready to see it. And perhaps that's why stories like this resonate so deeply, because, on some level, they speak to all of us. To how many times we've been reduced to a simplified version, judged by appearances, framed within labels we never asked to carry. Meanwhile, inside, the reality was far more complex, far stronger, far more silent than anyone could imagine. If, while listening to this, you feel a tightness in your chest, or remember a similar situation you've experienced or seen someone else experience, know that you're not alone. This space exists precisely for that, so that real stories, pent-up emotions, and silent truths can finally be shared. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Sometimes writing a sentence is already the beginning of letting out something that has been bottled up for too long. And if this story is captivating you, if you feel it deserves to continue being told, a simple like helps more than it seems. It shows that this type of content matters, that these stories need to reach more people who may still feel invisible, discredited, or misunderstood. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and take this message further. Subscribing to the channel is also a way of saying, I want to hear more stories like this. Stories that don't shout, don't humiliate, don't expose, but reveal. Stories that show that not all power makes noise and that not all strength needs to be announced. When you subscribe, you help build a community that values deep, human, and true narratives. And while you do that, the story continues to unfold, because that image that everyone bought into is about to be put to the test. Small details begin to slip out. Gestures previously ignored start to make sense, and the silence that seemed like submission begins to reveal something else, something no one expected, something that was there all along, just waiting for the right moment to surface. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because it was precisely in the smallest details that this story began to gain a silent weight. There weren't major humiliations, nor explicit scenes of disrespect. There were isolated phrases, almost always said jokingly, exchanged glances between people who thought they knew exactly how everything worked. Every day, situations where no one stood up to question anything because, after all, everything seemed so normal. At family gatherings, someone would comment that he held things together. Among friends, that observation disguised as a compliment would surface. It's a good thing you have him, isn't it? Even strangers, without knowing anything, reinforced the same idea with an almost unsettling ease. Each of these comments seemed harmless in isolation, but together they built a solid narrative, repeated so many times that it ended up being treated as absolute truth. The most curious thing is that almost no one understood the impact of this, because words have weight, even when spoken with a smile. And when a person hears, repeatedly, that they depend on another to exist, to sustain themselves, to survive, something begins to stir inside, not explosively, but silently. A slow, almost invisible transformation that shapes the mentality of everyone around them, and not just the person targeted by these phrases. She heard everything. She heard when they said he was the financial mastermind. She heard when they insinuated that, without him, things would fall apart. She heard when someone asked something important while looking directly at him, as if she weren't there. And yet, she remained calm, not because she agreed, but because she understood something that few understood. Confrontation doesn't always change people's perception. Sometimes it only strengthens their resistance. Meanwhile, the narrative continued its course. Friends repeated what they had heard from other friends. Family members reinforced the story without even checking what was happening behind the scenes. And what was happening behind the scenes, that's what held a hidden truth that no one seemed interested in seeing. Because truly seeing requires attention, requires a willingness to reconsider judgments, requires humility, and not everyone is ready for that. It's amazing how seemingly small comments can define big decisions. The way she was treated began to influence the space she was given in conversations, the respect with which her opinions were received, the real impact her words had, not for lack of substance, but for an excess of labels. And labels are comfortable for those observing from the outside because they simplify what is complex. Even so, something within her was never lost. There was a quiet clarity, a firm awareness of who she was and the path she was forging. A journey, built far from applause, far from external validation. While the world fed on appearances, she focused on the decisions that truly mattered, decisions that didn't need to be announced, only upheld. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable part of this story, realizing that many injustices don't stem from explicit evil, but from unconscious repetition, from the habit of accepting ready-made narratives, from the fear of questioning what everyone seems to agree on. The impact of this doesn't appear immediately, but accumulates. It infiltrates relationships, expectations, the way a person comes to be seen and treated. She knew that every stray phrase, every sideways glance, every unintentional comment was piling up something that sooner or later would have consequences, not as revenge, but as revelation, because the truth, when ignored for too long, finds other ways to manifest itself, and almost never in the way people expect. At this point in the story, nothing had yet exploded. Nothing had been directly exposed, but there was already a discomfort in the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible tension, as if something was organizing itself inside, waiting for the right moment to break the silence. And when that moment arrives, no comment small enough can contain the impact. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where many people get confused. Her silence was never empty. It was never absence. It was full of intention, of reading the environment, of awareness of what was happening around her. While everyone spoke, gave their opinions, explained their own version of the story, and reinforced the narrative that already seemed complete, she observed. She observed gestures, words, reactions. She observed who talked too much and who never asked anything. She observed how certain certainties were repeated without reflection, as truths that no one dared to touch. There were no confrontations, no attempts to justify herself, no speeches to prove her worth. And this, to an outsider, is often mistaken for submission or fear. But there's a huge difference between not reacting and not noticing. She noticed everything. Every snide comment, every decision made without consulting her, every time someone assumed she needed permission, help, or protection. Her silence wasn't retreat. It was an internal stance. Instead of wasting energy trying to change other people's mindsets, she chose to direct that energy inward, toward her own decisions, toward her own journey. A transformation was happening there, silent, invisible, but profound. A change in attitude that didn't depend on anyone's approval. While the world was distracted by appearances, she focused on what was happening behind the scenes, where things are truly built. This kind of silence requires strength. It requires emotional maturity, because responding to judgment is easy. Standing firm without having to explain anything is much more difficult. She knew that any word spoken at that moment would be used against her, distorted, or simply ignored. So she chose to wait, not out of indecision, but for clarity. Sometimes the best answer isn't immediate. It's consistent over time. The most interesting thing is that this silence began to generate discomfort in those who talked too much. People who were used to reactions began to feel strangely exposed in the absence of them. Because when someone doesn't engage in the game of justifications, the game loses part of its meaning. And this reveals a lot about those who constantly need to reaffirm their power. Deep down, she knew exactly what she was doing. Every choice was carefully considered. Every step was part of something bigger. There was no rush, because haste often reveals strategies prematurely. There was a hidden truth being protected, not as a secret out of fear, but as something that didn't yet need to be revealed. Not every truth needs to be spoken immediately to exist. Meanwhile, the impact of this silence began to subtly emerge. People continued talking, but they no longer had the same ready answers. Something no longer fit. There was a firmness in her gaze, a tranquility that didn't match the image of dependence they were trying to maintain. And when appearances begin to clash with inner reality, the narrative begins to crack. This was a period of deep observation, a time when she assessed who truly listened, who merely spoke, who respected even without understanding, a time when important decisions were made away from the spotlight. decisions that didn't seek external approval, but internal coherence. Because when the mindset changes, the path also changes, even if no one notices immediately. Her silence was a conscious choice not to diminish herself to fit the expectations of others. It was a silent refusal to engage in pointless disputes. It was the certainty that true impact comes not from noise, but from consistency. And little by little, this silence ceased to seem like passivity and began to sound like something more difficult to define. And precisely for that reason, more powerful. Nothing had yet been revealed. Nothing had come to light clearly. But those who paid attention sensed that something was reorganizing itself, as if history were being rewritten from within, line by line, without haste. And when that happens, there is no going back to the previous point, because certain transformations, once initiated, follow their own rhythm until the moment they cease to be invisible. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was precisely here that many people completely lost their way in interpreting what was happening. The conflict that almost broke everything didn't start explosively. It gradually built up, accumulating silences, misplaced expectations, and truths never spoken aloud. To those on the outside, it seemed like just another common relationship crisis. To those on the inside, it was a real breaking point, one that forces you to look inward and make decisions that change the course of your own journey. There was a moment when everything seemed about to crumble. Difficult conversations, long nights, that feeling that nothing that had been built up until then made sense anymore. For the first time, the image of stability that everyone had bought into began to crack. Some people even commented that now she would have to fend for herself, as if that were the moment when her supposed dependence would be exposed. But what no one realized was that, internally, something very different was happening. When the reconciliation happened, the shock didn't come from the fact that they stayed together, but from how the world interpreted it. To onlookers, it seemed she had backtracked, that she had given in, that once again she had chosen the easy way out because she couldn't walk alone. The narrative of dependency gained even more strength, now reinforced by a concrete event. "See, she can't do it," they said without saying it. And each of these comments fell like an invisible weight, increasing the frustration of those watching the story without knowing what was happening behind the scenes. What almost no one understood is that reconciliation is not synonymous with submission. Sometimes it arises from even greater clarity. She didn't return out of fear. She didn't return out of neediness. She didn't return for lack of options. She returned by conscious decision, because some choices are not made to prove anything to anyone, but to maintain consistency with one's own mindset and with the transformation that was already underway within. This reconciliation was strategic, even if no one used that word. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew what she was preserving, what she was observing, and most importantly, what she was postponing. Not every truth needs to be revealed in the heat of conflict. Some gain more impact when they mature in silence, and she was willing to bear the weight of being misunderstood for a while longer, if it meant protecting something greater. For the audience watching from the outside, this is one of the most uncomfortable moments in the story, because it generates frustration. It creates that feeling of, how could this be? The audience begins to wonder why someone would choose a path that seems to go against their own self-worth. And that's exactly where the curiosity grows. Because deep down, there's a perception that something isn't being told in its entirety. There's a hidden truth that hasn't yet found space to come to light. While everyone discussed the reconciliation as a sign of weakness, she continued observing who felt entitled to an opinion, who was disappointed by a version they themselves had created, who silently hoped that the story would have a different ending than expected. Each reaction was another. Piece in the puzzle she was assembling internally. Each judgment reinforced her certainty that control of the narrative was never truly in the hands of those who spoke the loudest. This phase demanded even more emotional balance, because upholding a misunderstood decision comes at a high price. It's easy to be applauded when choices please. It's difficult to remain firm when they frustrate external expectations. But she was no longer living to meet expectations. She was living her own journey, even if it meant walking through a stretch where no one applauded. Behind the reconciliation, important decisions continued to be made behind the scenes. Adjustments, planning, silent reorganizations. The appearance that everything had returned to normal was convenient for many, but inside, nothing was the same anymore. Her mindset had already changed. And when the mindset changes, the relationship with time changes, with power changes, with waiting changes. There was no anxiety to prove anything. There was patience in letting the revelations happen at the right pace. This moment marked a point of no return, not because something was exposed, but because something was definitively understood by her. The reconciliation did not erase what was seen, heard, and felt. On the contrary, it solidified the certainty that some stories only make sense when told to the end, and that interrupting them prematurely can completely distort their impact. To the quick observer, it seems contradictory. To the more discerning observer, it's an emotional strategy, and it's precisely in this space between what appears to be and what truly is that this story continues to unfold, building tension, preparing the ground for something that hasn't yet been said, but which has already begun to manifest itself in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was at this point that something began to slip through the cracks of the official narrative. Not in an overt way, not as a direct revelation, but as those details that are unsettling precisely because they don't make a sound. Small situations that in isolation could easily be ignored, but which together began to paint a picture of a reality different from the one everyone was repeating. It was a bill paid by mistake, a receipt left on the table unintentionally, a snide comment about a payment already settled when everyone believed she hadn't been the one to resolve it. Small, almost invisible things, but things that didn't fit the image of someone totally dependent. After all, those who are dependent don't anticipate. Those who are dependent don't resolve things in silence. Those who are dependent don't sign important documents as if it were just another everyday decision. She never bothered to explain. She never pointed out these inconsistencies. She let them pass as coincidence, as something unimportant. And, perhaps, that was one of the most strategic parts of the whole journey, because when you explain too much, you take away people's chance to realize it on their own. And when someone realizes it on their own, the impact is much greater. Some financial decisions began to emerge so naturally that no one questioned their origin. Subtle changes in spending patterns, choices made with too much confidence for someone who, theoretically, had no control whatsoever. And yet, the old narrative persisted, because it was too comfortable to abandon. Questioning it would require admitting that everyone had been fooled for too long. Behind the scenes, things remained active. There was a silent organization happening there. Nothing theatrical, nothing dramatic. Just consistency. Documents signed without fanfare. Responsibilities assumed without the need for recognition. She didn't do this to prove her worth, but because that's always how she operated. Resolving issues before announcing them. Sustaining them before showing them off. The most curious thing is that these details didn't generate confrontation, but discomfort. A discomfort difficult to explain. Something that made people change the subject too quickly or pretend they didn't see it. Because admitting that something was out of place meant touching on a hidden truth that could destabilize everything that seemed solid until then. Some began to feel that the story had layers that had never been told. that there was a difference between what was said in public and what happened in practice. And this difference didn't shout, it whispered. It whispered through numbers, decisions, and attitudes that didn't ask for applause. They simply existed. She continued exactly as before, calm, observant, unhurried. The mindset was already clear within her. There was no anxiety about being recognized, because external recognition wouldn't change anything that was already structured inside. The true impact was being built, with time, patience, and precision. And those who learn to wait don't get lost when no one understands the process. Gradually, her confidence began to show, even without words. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't provocation, it was firmness. A firmness that doesn't go hand in hand with dependence, and the more this firmness appeared, the harder it became to maintain the old narrative effortlessly. Something was out of place, even if no one knew exactly what. These small clues began to accumulate, not to generate an immediate shock, but to prepare the ground, as if history itself were creating space for something bigger, something that couldn't be thrown on the table all at once, because it first needed to be felt, perceived, intuited. Some revelations don't arrive as news, they arrive as discomfort. And while everyone tried to keep up appearances, reality unfolded behind the scenes. Decisions were being made, structures were being upheld, paths were being adjusted, all with a naturalness that only someone in internal control can maintain. Her journey no longer depended on the validation of others, and that completely changed how she moved through the world. It wasn't the time for explanations yet. It wasn't the time to put all the pieces together. But it was already clear that something big was hidden behind seemingly small details. And when details start not to fit together, it's a sign that the story we've told so far might be incomplete. Perhaps it's about to be crossed by a truth that didn't ask permission to exist, only waited for the right moment to reveal itself. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the story begins to move in a way that is almost imperceptible to those who only observe the surface. The turning point didn't happen with an announcement, it wasn't accompanied by a confrontation, it didn't require an audience, it began behind the scenes, where almost no one looks, but where everything that really matters is decided. While he maintained a controlling posture, a firm voice, the image of someone holding the reins, it was she who sustained the real stability of what existed between them and beyond them. None of this was done to impress. There was no need to prove strength, because the strength was already in action. Decisions made at the right time, responsibilities assumed naturally, adjustments made even before anyone realized something needed adjusting. She operated on a different level, where impact doesn't depend on applause. What sustained that structure wasn't the discourse, it was the consistency. To an outside observer, everything seemed the same apparent dynamics, the same social roles, the same repeated lines. But inside, the machinery no longer functioned in the same way. Stability no longer came from the figure at the center of the narrative. It came from silent choices, from a firm mindset, from someone who understood that power is not about who speaks the loudest, but about who keeps everything standing when no one is watching. She didn't expose, she didn't correct, she didn't seek recognition, because recognition was never the goal. The focus was on the journey, on the path built step by step, without haste. There's a type of transformation that doesn't change the tone of voice, but completely changes how someone positions themselves in the world. And that's exactly what was happening there. While he reinforced the image of control, she reinforced the base. While he occupied the visible space, she organized the invisible. And this creates a powerful, albeit silent, contrast, because those who truly support don't need to dominate. They don't need to diminish the other. They don't need to constantly reaffirm authority. They simply act. Some people began to feel this change without being able to explain it. It wasn't something you could point to. It was more of a feeling that there was a different kind of security in the air, a tranquility that didn't fit with the idea of dependence, a firmness that didn't ask permission to exist. The hidden truth remained there, intact, protected by the very silence that had allowed it to grow. She understood something few understand. Displaying power prematurely weakens the process, because when power is real, it doesn't need to be announced. It reveals itself on its own, at the right time, when the impact is inevitable. And until then, the best thing to do is to sustain it, nurture it, decide clearly, and move forward without being distracted by others' interpretations. This silent turnaround wasn't intended to become a spectacle. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't public correction, it wasn't theatrical justice. It was balance, it was coherence, it was someone who knew exactly where they were standing and why. Emotional, financial, and structural stability no longer depended on appearances. It depended on continuous actions that no one saw, but that everyone felt. Gradually, this began to subtly alter the dynamic. He still spoke as if in command, but he no longer decided everything. He no longer upheld everything. He was no longer the sole point of control, and yet nothing was exposed, because she didn't need to take anything from him to occupy her own place. The space opened up naturally, as always happens when someone assumes their own power without fighting for it. This is the kind of twist that is disconcerting because it doesn't create a dramatic scene. It doesn't offer catchy lines. It doesn't create obvious villains or heroes. It simply changes the flow of the story from within. And when that happens, the old narrative starts to become too fragile to stand on its own. It still exists, but it no longer convinces as it once did. Those who look closely notice that something has changed. Those who glance quickly continue to think that everything is the same. And it is precisely in this difference in perception that the story progresses, because invisible power, when it matures enough, no longer needs to hide. It simply waits for the moment when reality itself can no longer disguise it. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there comes a point when reality no longer accepts being kept behind the scenes. Not out of revenge, not out of a desire to expose anyone, but out of necessity. The truth, when kept silent for too long, finds its own way to surface. And when that happens, there are no screams, no scene, no spectacle. There is embarrassment. A kind of impact that doesn't explode, it just settles in. The situation was public, unavoidable, almost banal at first glance. A context in which decisions needed to be made right there in front of everyone. Numbers presented, responsibilities defined, signatures required. None of this was planned as a revelation, but everything ended up functioning as such. Because at that specific moment, it was no longer possible to maintain appearances without touching the real structure that kept everything running. People expected him to solve it, to take responsibility, to stand up for it, as they had always imagined would happen. But something didn't fit. There was an awkward pause, a sideways glance, a silence too heavy to ignore. And then, with almost disconcerting naturalness, she stepped forward, without a speech, without a long explanation, just with the clarity of someone already used to doing this. It was there that the narrative began to unravel before everyone's eyes, not because someone announced the truth, but because practice revealed it. Who was really paying? Who was supporting the decisions? Who was keeping the structure standing when action was needed? All of this appeared in a raw, objective way, impossible to reinterpret as coincidence. The shock didn't come with noise. It came with that awkward silence that fills the room when something obvious finally becomes apparent. People avoiding eye contact, others trying to mentally reorganize everything they had believed up to that point. Comments that died before they were spoken, because at that moment nobody needed to say anything. The truth had already filled the entire space. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. He didn't take the opportunity to correct anyone. She continued exactly as she always had been, firm, discreet, direct. Because this wasn't an end point, it was merely a natural consequence of a journey that had been built over a long time. The impact wasn't in the gesture, but in the contrast between what everyone thought and what was happening before their eyes. Some felt shame, others disbelief. There were those who tried to downplay it, those who sought alternative explanations, those who pretended that nothing serious had happened. But internally, something had already changed. The collective mentality underwent a silent shift. That old version of the story no longer held up so easily. The most powerful aspect of this moment wasn't the revelation itself, but the realization that no one was deceived by it. People deceived themselves by accepting a comfortable narrative without looking behind the scenes. And this kind of discovery hurts because it forces us to reconsider judgments, phrases spoken, glances cast, certainties repeated without reflection. She moved on quietly, like someone who has resolved a necessary issue and is now on to the next point. But the atmosphere was no longer the same. The balance had shifted, not through imposition, but through evidence. When the truth reveals itself without aggression, it leaves no room for confrontation, only for assimilation. This was the kind of moment that redefines relationships without needing to break anything, because after you see who truly sustains, who truly decides, who truly maintains stability, you can't pretend nothing happened. Something reorganizes itself internally, a new understanding forms. And even if no one verbalizes it, everyone knows they crossed an invisible boundary. Her journey didn't need applause, it only needed consistency. And that consistency, in that public moment, became impossible to ignore, not as a trophy, but as a fact. A fact that came to exist for everyone, even if no one yet knew what to do with it. And when a truth of this magnitude comes to light without fanfare, it doesn't end the story. It shifts it. It opens space for new perspectives, new decisions, new silences, because from that point on, nothing could ever be exactly as it was before. There were still things to be digested, reactions to mature, consequences to manifest themselves in due time. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after the truth comes out, even silently, something begins to crumble inside the people who held the old narrative. It's not a dramatic fall. There's no scene, no public apology. It's an internal fall, an uncomfortable adjustment between what was believed and what can no longer be ignored. The same people who once spoke with such certainty begin to measure their words. Their gazes change, their posture changes. Not because she demanded respect, but because reality imposed itself. It is at this moment that emotional justice occurs, not as revenge, but as a consequence. When someone realizes they judged wrongly, silence weighs more than any corrective speech. She didn't need to say, "I told you so." She didn't need to rehash old phrases. She didn't need to confront anyone. Her silence now carried a different weight. It was no longer interpreted as weakness, but as mastery. A mastery that doesn't come from imposition, but from clarity. Because those who know exactly who they are don't need to dispute narratives. Authority shifts sides quietly. There's no coronation, no official announcement, just a subtle change in the axis of relationships. People begin to consult her, to listen to her more attentively, waiting for her reaction before drawing conclusions. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. A recognition that arises when appearances crumble and all that remains is consistency. What was most uncomfortable for many wasn't discovering that she supported more than they imagined. It was realizing that the comfortable story they told about her said more about them than about her. Revelations of this kind don't just expose facts. They expose mindsets. They expose how easily someone who doesn't make a fuss is underestimated. They expose the habit of confusing silence with incapacity. And while some tried to reorganize their own perception, she moved forward with the same posture as always, without changing her tone, without hardening her gaze, without demanding belated recognition. Because her journey was never about correcting the past of others, but about honoring her own path. There is something profoundly transformative about this type of emotional justice. It doesn't humiliate, it doesn't directly embarrass, it doesn't hurt. It simply reveals. And when the revelation happens, each person needs to deal with the impact of their own mistaken judgment. Some manage to mature from it. Others prefer to pretend that nothing has changed. But in both cases, the old narrative no longer works. Her strength was now undeniable, precisely because it didn't need to be announced. It was in the way she occupied spaces, in the confidence of her decisions, in the tranquility she displayed in situations that previously generated tension. Anyone observing closely notices that something has solidified there, a change that no longer depends on external context to sustain itself. Her silence, which had previously been interpreted as absence, now functioned as a complete presence, a presence that doesn't compete for attention, but naturally attracts it. And this completely shifts the power dynamic, because real power doesn't need to be defended, it is simply recognized. Some relationships began to rebalance, others became strained, full of unspoken issues. There's always an adjustment period when a hidden truth comes to light, a time when people try to understand where they fit into this new interpretation of history. And it neither facilitated nor hindered this process. It simply maintained coherence. What's most interesting is that, even with the old narrative crumbling, she didn't change her essence. She didn't become harsh, resentful, or distant. She remained who she always was, only now seen in a different light. And this reinforces something important. Her power was always there. The world just took a while to see it. This moment marks a profound, albeit silent, turning point. It is not the end of the story, but an irreversible shift. Once authority changes sides, nothing returns exactly to the previous state. Decisions take on a different weight, words a different impact, silences a different meaning. And it is precisely in this new space, where the old narrative no longer holds up and the new one is still forming, that the story continues to unfold. Because when emotional justice happens quietly, it doesn't close cycles. It opens up even deeper layers of understanding, choices and consequences that need to gradually find their place. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there is something very powerful in what she never needed to say. In a world that demands constant explanations, defenses, and declarations of value, she chose another path. Not because she lacked arguments, but because she understood, sooner or later, that proving something to someone who has already decided not to see is a pointless drain. She never wanted to convince anyone. She never wanted to correct others' perceptions. She never wanted to compete for space in a narrative she didn't create. There is a silent freedom when someone stops trying to be understood by everyone, and that's exactly where the transformation solidified. She knew who she was. She knew what stood for her. She knew the decisions she made behind the scenes, and that was enough. Her strength didn't need to be announced because it manifested itself in everyday life, in coherent choices, in the tranquility she felt in situations that would previously have been used to diminish her. Many people confuse power with noise. They confuse authority with imposition. They confuse respect with fear. She never played that game. The real power she wielded didn't come from a need to be seen, but from the ability to maintain it without fanfare. And that kind of power, when it's genuine, finds its own way to reveal itself, not through speeches, but through impact. She never said, "I do." She never needed to say, "I'm the one who sustains." She never needed to point out mistakes or expose anyone to elevate herself, because recognition that comes from exposure is usually fragile. But recognition that comes from observation is profound, lasting, and impossible to undo. People started to notice on their own, and when that happens, there's no argument that can reverse it. This point in the story deeply resonates with those who have been underestimated, those who have been seen as weak simply because they didn't shout, those whose decisions have been ignored, abilities questioned, and strength doubted. There's an immediate identification with this kind of journey because it's not rare, it's just rarely told. Many people end up supporting more than they receive credit for, solving more than they imagine, holding up structures that no one sees. She understood something essential. Announcing strength prematurely is surrendering power, because those who depend on applause become hostages to the reactions of others. She didn't want that. She preferred to walk in silence, build with consistency, and let reality speak for itself. And when reality speaks, there's no need for explanations. The most beautiful thing about this process is that even after the truth began to be revealed, it didn't change its tone. It didn't impose itself. It didn't demand emotional reparations. It remained who it always was, because the goal was never to reverse humiliation, but to restore balance. And balance isn't imposed. It manifests itself. This attitude generates something rare, genuine respect. Not forced respect, but the kind that arises when someone realizes they were wrong and learns from it. Some people grow in that moment, others distance themselves, and she didn't try to control either of those reactions, because those who are secure in their own worth don't need to manage the perceptions of others. Her power revealed itself because it had always been there. It wasn't built for that specific moment. It wasn't a response to others' judgment. It was the result of a firm mindset, a consistent journey, and decisions made away from the public eye. The impact came as a consequence, not as an objective. This is the kind of strength that doesn't fade when the situation changes. That doesn't depend on who's around. That isn't shaken by misinterpretations, and that's why she never needed to say anything, because silence, when accompanied by coherence, speaks louder than any explanation. There is something profoundly transformative about realizing that you don't need to convince anyone to move forward, that your journey doesn't need validation to be legitimate. That true power lies not in proving, but in being. And when someone reaches that place, the relationships around them inevitably reorganize themselves, some through closeness, others through distance. This part of the story doesn't close cycles, it deepens them, because after someone understands that they don't need to announce themselves, they begin to see more clearly what still needs to be adjusted, decided, faced. The truth that came to light didn't end anything. It only opened space for more. Aligned choices, for more conscious silences, for steps that now carry a different weight. And it is at this point, where what was left unsaid becomes more important than any word spoken, that the story continues to unfold, moving towards consequences that have not yet fully appeared, but which have already begun to stir within. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where many people can finally breathe a sigh of relief. Reconciliation does exist, but it no longer carries the weight of submission, nor the imbalance of before. It's not a return to the starting point, it's a reunion on another level. Something has definitively changed, even if not everything has been verbalized. Clarity now occupies the space where there were previously assumptions. Nothing needed to be renegotiated in a demanding tone. There were no long speeches, nor a need to revisit every detail of the past. What changed was the foundation, the mentality. Decisions now come from a different place, more aligned with the truth that can no longer be ignored. When the real structure is revealed, there's no way to pretend nothing happened. And curiously, this doesn't generate war. It generates adjustment. He also realized it. Perhaps not in words, perhaps not immediately, but he realized it. The controlling posture no longer made sense in the same way, not because it was forcibly removed, but because it lost its foundation. When someone understands that they don't alone occupy the center of stability, something shifts internally, and this shift can generate resistance or maturity. In this case, it opened space for a new type of relationship. Reconciliation now is not based on appearances. It's based on silent recognition. There is no humiliation because she never sought that. There is no revenge because that would require too much energy for something that is no longer part of her journey. There is only balance, a balance that doesn't need to be announced, but that is felt in the way conversations happen, how decisions are made, how silences are respected. She didn't need to impose new terms. They simply emerged. When someone takes a firm internal stance, the world around them reorganizes itself. Expectations change, boundaries become clearer, and what once seemed normal ceases to be acceptable without a single word being said. That's emotional maturity in action. For those who follow this story, there is a clear sense of emotional justice. Not the kind of justice that exposes, that embarrasses, that becomes a spectacle, but the kind that restores, the kind that returns dignity, the kind that allows one to move forward without carrying resentment. Seeing someone recognized without needing to justify themselves is deeply touching because it shows that not all reparations need to be noisy to be real. Relief comes precisely from that, from the realization that silent strength was enough. That truth found its place without needing to trample on anyone. That respect is not demanded, it is built. And when that happens, relationships become more honest, even if leaner, even if less idealized. Nothing here is a closed ending, because true reconciliations don't end stories, they inaugurate new phases. Now there are different layers to be explored, decisions that take on a different weight, conversations that gain another level of depth. The journey continues, but with less noise and more awareness. What remains is the feeling that something has been put in its rightful place, not because someone lost, but because someone ceased to be invisible. And that changes everything. It changes the way we walk, the way we choose, the way we remain. The truth that emerged didn't come to separate, it came to align, and alignment always requires time to be truly experienced. There are still nuances, subtle consequences, reactions that only appear as the days go by. Because when a relationship shifts, not everything falls into place at once. Some things require more observation, others require firmer decisions. And she, with her usual composure, remains attentive, aware, without any hurry to control the outcome. This story doesn't end in applause. It ends in restored respect. And it is precisely this kind of silent ending that prepares the ground for even deeper reflections on value, presence, choices, and everything that is only understood after appearances fade. If this part resonated with you in any way, comment below. This makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this story resonated with you on some level. And that, in itself, says a lot. Content like this isn't meant to be skimmed, but for those who like to look beyond the surface, who understand that there are truths that only emerge when we listen more carefully. If this type of narrative adds value to you, if it helps you see situations more clearly, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to stay connected to these stories that deliver value without making a fuss. If you feel like it, leave a comment saying you made it to the end. You can write something like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." This helps create a space for exchange, where each person realizes they are not alone in their own experiences. And if at any point you felt a connection, a like is also a silent way of saying that this conversation made sense to you. Oh, and before you go, there's a video over here that complements this topic very well. It delves deeper into other points that connect with everything you've just heard. Click there and continue reading.